Hi folks, this is chapter 34. This is the first chapter of the Bio 102 semester. We're going to start this semester talking about the biosphere, so Earth's diverse environments, and why we should study and pay attention to what's going on in our natural world. So to give you a little background and a little example of what happens when we don't have a good understanding of our interaction with our natural world. There was a time back in the 50s and 60s where we knew that we were creating toxins in our world, but there was a saying that went, the solution to pollution is dilution. It was just thought that we could simply sort of flush toxins out of our environments into our waterways and eventually it would just be gone. But in 1969, the Cuyahoga River in between Cleveland and Akron, Ohio, not only was the river completely devoid of any fish or any other living organisms, the river itself actually caught fire. So this brought it grew some awareness of how we were abusing our environment, and actually developed, it led to legislation which included creating a federal agency called the Environmental Protection Agency, intended to develop legislations to protect our natural resources. And today we know that these environmental concerns are still some of the most pressing issues that we face. We're constantly still trying to learn and understand how our use of the environment is leaving a legacy. So it's vital that we understand this so that we not only live happy, healthy lives here ourselves and enjoy the benefits of our natural resources, but we're leaving the planet in a way that future generations are going to be able to be sustainable and meet their needs as well. So for this chapter, we're going to have some main ideas that we'll discuss. We'll define what we mean by the biosphere, and then we'll talk about different types of, we'll call them biomes. And again, that you're studying this course of biology. We're talking about the living world. So the biosphere being the whole of the living things on the planet. And biomes are different environments within our biosphere. So those living environments, both in the water and on land. So what are we talking about when we say biosphere? What does that even mean? And who are ecologists? So ecologists are the scientists who study the interactions of organisms, which we should have defined organisms last semester. Organisms are living things. So it's the scientists who study the interactions between living things and their physical environment. The organisms can have interactions in a couple of ways. So there are biotic factors, things that are living, the living things in an area. The living component of the environment can affect an organism. And the abiotic, so the non-living components, the physical and chemical parts of the environment also affect an organism. And when we use the word habitat, that includes both those living components of the environment and the non-living parts of the environment. So the habitat includes the whole of all of those living and non-living interactions happening together. So as you may know, scientists like to create categories. So we kind of categorize things based on the levels at which we're looking at them and how they're being studied. So we can study things at the organism level, just meaning that one individual living thing, we're taking a look at that one thing. So if we use ourselves as an example, you go to the doctor and the doctor's looking over you to see that you're healthy. That's a study at the organism level. When we study a group of individuals of the same species, so a room full of people, for example, that's the study at the population level. When you put different populations, so maybe a population of people and a population of dogs and a population of cats and a population of trees all together, that's studying things at the community level. And then when you take a look at those communities and how those groups of communities interact with the abiotic components of the environment, then we're looking at things at the whole ecosystem level. So the whole system, living and non-living, all working together. We can also look at things from a landscape perspective. This is how it's usually thinking about things like looking at things from the air and how we can see how the landscape, how there are physical changes within the landscape that we can kind of divide up different types of environments. But when we talk about the biosphere, going back to defining what we're talking about there, this is the whole of the living part of Earth. So it extends from the atmosphere to miles below the depths of the ocean. So it's all of the part of Earth that's inhabited by life we refer to as the biosphere. So that's the whole planet's living ecosystem. So there was a time that we people arrogantly thought that nature was just sort of a force that we could tame and control and use for our purposes. We didn't really understand that we are a part of nature, and as we attempt to control it too much, it actually has a detrimental effect not just on other organisms, but on us as well. A good example of this was in the 1950s, there were chemical pesticides that were developed, and it was thought that this was a miracle for controlling, both pests to us like mosquitoes, as well as the pests that could harm farming crops. So there was a chemical called DDT, and it was used very widely. But it also led to some questions. Those questions are, if we're spraying this stuff on our food and then we eat it, what happens to that in our bodies? We also found that this stuff was remaining in the soil and water a whole lot longer, a whole lot later than later than it was applied to the environment. And for decades, birds of prey were suffering because this chemical actually, as birds were eating the things that they eat, they were ingesting this stuff, and it led to them laying eggs that were the shells wouldn't harden, and they were too weak to support the embryo inside the egg, and there was an enormous decline in the populations of bald eagles and hawks and all kinds of predatory birds. So in the early 60s, there was a marine biologist. She worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Her name was Rachel Carson. And she really started to pay attention to this pesticide issue and what it was doing to our natural world and to humans. And she wrote a really amazing book called Silent Spring. And it really brought attention. The regular, everyday American was able to sort of read about what we were doing to our environment, and it really helped us become aware of some of these concerns and how trying to manipulate the environment could really lead to long-lasting detrimental effects on many populations, including human populations. And she really was an advocate, too, for a new approach to controlling pests that took the health of the whole ecosystem into account, not just that one pest. That we need to not just have a narrow approach to environmental issues. We need to move in a path that considers the ecosystem as a whole in moving forward. And this is a photo, I think this is a beach in New Jersey where they were spraying DDT. And as you can see, I think they were trying to help control mosquitoes, but spraying it right, this poor little kid here is just right in the path of that horrible cloud. And I'm really glad that we don't see photos like this being taken here in the US anyway these days. Okay, so what are the different factors that influence life in our biosphere? There can be a number of things, including the chemical and physical factors. So what are those? So we talked in Bio 101 about some of the things that all life needs in order to remain living. We all need an energy source. So we're talking about things here like most of the organisms on the planet get their source, their original source of energy comes from the sun, because the sun is what drives photosynthesis in plants, and the plants are sort of the building, the fundamental building block of our energy, the things that living things consume. But there are parts of the world where no sunlight reaches, like deep sea vents and things, so that there are organisms that have become adapted to live on chemical energy. So things like deep sea tube worms that can consume, they have bacteria incorporated in their tissues that can consume sulfur as an energy source. Temperature. Temperature can affect the metabolism of organisms, and organisms that live in extreme temperatures have to develop adaptations to enable them to live in those types of environments. We know that all things need to have the presence of water. Living organisms need water to survive. We all need inorganic nutrients, so things that we consume that help to build our tissues and cellular structures. And then there are environmental factors that influence how things live. So whether they're aquatic organisms or terrestrial factors, things that are on the landscapes that may affect how living things adapt and grow. One of the most influential factors that an organism has to deal with is the climate. And what do we mean when we talk about the climate? This is how temperature and precipitation are driven in an area, and how that climate determines what types of organisms are able to survive and live there. Most of the climatic variations on the Earth are due to the fact that the Earth actually receives uneven distribution of heat, so that helps to develop really predictable patterns of precipitation and winds and ocean currents that really drive the weather around the world. And then there are also this interaction of landforms like mountains and things that also affect how precipitation occurs on the planet. So when we talk about uneven distribution of sunlight on the planet, so we've all probably heard of the equator. This is at what we call 0 degrees latitude. So this is the most direct sunlight. So the sun is coming almost directly straight at the equator at 0 degrees latitude. And as we move north and south of the equator, those numbers increase. So the degrees latitude, as you move further from the equator, you have a higher degrees latitude. I think we're somewhere at like 38, something like that. So, as we move further from the equator, the sunlight is hitting the planet at a more of an angle, so it's not as direct. You can see that, so that light is actually kind of being dissipated before it actually can reach the planet. And not only that, but the Earth also has a permanent tilt on its axis. And this is how we get the seasons of the year. So this is also something that helps to drive how the climate changes throughout the year. As you can see, this, not sure if I can erase my line there, but you can see, sorry about that, that this line moving through the Earth is always, it's constant. So no matter where we are in our rotation around the sun, the tilt of the Earth remains the same. So what that means is that as the Earth is orbiting around the sun, at different times of the year, we're either tilted more closely or further away from the sun. So as you can see here in what we refer to as the June solstice, so in the middle of June, the northern hemisphere is most directly, this is when we are most closely tilted towards the sun, which is why we enjoy our summer months in the northern hemisphere in June, July, and August. On the flip side of that, by December, we have moved into a way where this tilt, this constant tilt that the Earth has, is tilted, the northern hemisphere is tilted farther away from the sun, giving us our cooler winter months in December, January, February. So, and on the other hand, the southern hemisphere is more closely tilted towards the sun, which is why in the southern hemisphere, they're enjoying their summer when we have winter. So something else that happens due to the uneven heating of the Earth is that rainforests near the equator form. And this is where there's lots of evaporation because it's so hot on the surface, and then that evaporation, as it rises, it cools and then becomes rainfall. So we see lots of the tropical, this is why we have tropical rainforests close to the equator. But then what doesn't fall will move away from the tropics, and that air becomes dry and pulls water from the Earth's surface. So what happens here is this dry air falls, it causes, it pulls water from the Earth's surface, causing evaporation, and this is where the Sahara and Arabian deserts occur. So you can see too how this unequal distribution of the sunlight on the planet helps to create different environments on the Earth's surface as well. So because of this, because of the unequal distribution of heat driving air currents, as we saw in the last slide, and also due to the rotation of the Earth beneath the atmosphere, there are these constant wind conditions that are really predictable. We refer to those as the trade winds. And the trade winds or prevailing winds, we also call them. And those prevailing winds and the Earth's uneven heating are what drive how the waters in the oceans move, or we also call them ocean currents. So these are cycles of how the currents flow, how the ocean waters flow, and how water temperatures are carried. And these different water temperatures, as they become warmer in some regions and cooler patterns in other regions, these really drive our weather patterns throughout the planet. So those prevailing winds drive the ocean currents, and the ocean currents drive our weather patterns. And in coastal areas, we also see that land masses can have an effect on climate. So as water and winds move up one side of a mountain, we have this rain shield effect of moisture in the air that's being driven over the mountain. That moisture is lost as it hits the land, so that we see that mountains often have a rainy side, and a windward side. So as air and moisture is driven over land masses, it also has an effect on these weather patterns as well. And we see that on one side of the island, mountain, there's often what we call a rain-shadowed desert. Okay, so I mentioned that we're going to talk about not only the physical wind and climate patterns, but where organisms live is also important to how they interact with their environment. So we'll start with talking about aquatic biomes. So we're talking about the ocean and lakes and rivers and streams. So there are different places where living things occur within aquatic environments, and we'll show a graphic that allows you to sort of see this better. But we'll talk about the pelagic realm, which is the open water, the benthic realm, which consists of here it says sea floor, but it's also the floor of a stream, the floor, what's underneath on the bottom of a stream or river. The area that's referred to as aphotic, which is where there is not, it's deep enough that there's not enough sunlight for photosynthesis to occur. And then there's the photic zone, where light penetration allows photosynthesis to take place, and plants and algae and other kinds of plankton can use sunlight to photosynthesize and make organic matter. And when we say plankton, those are microscopic organisms that live in the water, on top of the water column or in the water column. And there are a couple different types. There's phytoplankton, which are mostly more closely related to plants. And we could say phyto because they actually use sunlight to do photosynthesis. And then there are zooplankton. They're more closely linked to, I would say, animals, because they actually consume phytoplankton. They can't make their own organic matter. They have to consume other living things for that organic matter. And we'll talk too about different types of marine environments, or not all, marine refers to seawater, but there are also areas where freshwater is influential. So there are intertidal zone, where the ocean, that's where the waves crash on the beach. That's where the ocean meets the land. We'll talk about what an estuary is. This is an area where freshwater and ocean water merge and interact. And then there are transitional wetlands that are sort of aquatic and sort of terrestrial. So I mentioned that we would go back and show you a graphic so you could see what these different realms, what we're referring to. So here, that pelagic realm, it's essentially all of the blue. That's all of the open water where living things may occur. And the benthic, so when we talk about the benthic, we're talking about the actual bottom of the sea or the stream. The aphotic zone, so we see here there are things that live in the depths. We have where it's about more than 1,000 meters deep. No light can penetrate. So those are where organisms live who can use chemical energy for making organic matter. And I mentioned those deep sea tube worms that can use sulfur to make organic matter. And then there's this area that some sunlight can penetrate, but it's mostly aphotic. But the photic zone is really only about 200 meters deep. So sunlight can only really strongly penetrate for photosynthetic purposes to about 200 meters. I mentioned plankton, so these are microscopic organisms that live in this photic zone. There are the phytoplankton, and here they're colored green, and they almost always are, and that's because they have chlorophyll, which is the the pigment that allows sunlight to be trapped and converted into organic matter. And then those microscopic zooplankton that will be feeding on the phytoplankton. This is a coral reef. Coral reefs are some of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet, and these occur in the photic zone. They are they need photosynthesis in order to live and thrive. Beautiful, really amazing ecosystems. This is an estuary, and I actually want to show you, when we talk about estuaries, this is where oh, bear with me. Where freshwater and saltwater meet, and one of the biggest, most productive estuaries on the planet actually is right where we live. So we're like right about here in Berkeley County. So we're within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So the Chesapeake Bay is an estuary. And what we mean by that is that here it's receiving, oh, I don't have my pen anymore, but it's getting salt water coming in from the ocean, and it's also heavily influenced by fresh water coming in from the rivers and streams. So here's the Susquehanna River, the Potomac, which we live right on the Potomac River, fresh water that's entering this estuary, and as it really creates a very unique living environment, because some organisms can only live in certain salinities, and as the salinity changes throughout this estuary, we get a really diverse array of different types of fish and other organisms that can live in these very unique environments. So not everything can live in the ocean, not everything can live in fresh water, and very few things can live, there are very few places where some of these really unique organisms are able to thrive in these varying levels of salinity. So just something cool to think about when you're talking about estuaries, that we have a really important one pretty much in our backyard. Okay, I have to find our slide again. Okay, so again, going back to freshwater versus saltwater, talking about freshwater biomes is a little bit different than talking about oceans and open waters. So we have a couple of different types of freshwater environments. We have standing water environments like lakes and ponds, and then there are flowing water environments like rivers and streams. And because these are within the terrestrial environment, unlike the open ocean, they're heavily influenced by what we do on, but both the landscape itself and how we treat those landscapes. So if you can imagine a river that runs through a city is much more influenced by what's done in that city and what kinds of activities go on than 30 miles out of the city. Just another image showing you couple of those different realms, and these occur the benthic realm and photic zone and aphotic zone, depending on how large and deep a freshwater biome is. They have those similar characteristics as well. So there's So the benthic realm, the bottom, is referred to as the benthic realm, both in saltwater environments and in freshwater environments. The photic zone is, again, as about 200 meters deep. That's about as deep as light can efficiently penetrate the water without being reflected too far out. And if a lake or river is deeper than 200 meters, there can be an aphotic zone as well. Just a picture showing what we're talking about when we say that there are flowing biomes and standing biomes. This would be a flowing biome. We've got a little waterfall, so we know that the water's moving and flowing through that system. And standing water biomes are things like lakes and ponds where there's not a source of water coming in and there's no outlet to let that water flow all the way through the system. Okay, so when we talk about terrestrial biomes, we're talking about the environments on land and the organisms that live there. So they're grouped in, again, we'll talk all semester about how scientists like to group things, but they're grouped into 9 major types that are primarily defined by what kind of vegetation is able to live there. That vegetation is largely dependent on what the climate is like, so most of these ecosystems are based on climate. Temperature and precipitation is really what defines what types of vegetation can survive in an area. So that's really how these terrestrial biomes are driven and defined. But that being said, there can be biomes of very similar types in very different places. So if the climates are the same, even if they're not near one another, these different biomes may occur geographically distant from one another because their climates are similar. So this is a general distribution of the 9 types of systems that we're talking about. And if you can look across the planet, you can see that even though there are places that are not closely geographically close to one another, they're the same type of defined biome based on the similar climates. So there's similar climate in Central South America as there is in the central part of Africa, for example, and the northern part of North America is very similar to the northern part of Europe and Asia. So tropical forests, so we see here that these are areas, there's this green color, so these are areas that are clustered closely to the equator, so they're dispersed throughout the planet, but they're most closely within these regions that we refer to as the tropics, so that they're between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, closely kind of clumped around the equator. So here is an example of a tropical rainforest. Again, they occur in near the equator, equatorial areas. You can see here how they're distributed. There's the blue line is the equator. They experience warm temperatures and warm days, long days, because this is where the sunlight is most direct. Days are about 11 to 12 hours long year-round, sort of like we experience longer days in the summer. They have long days all year round. They have quite a lot of rainfall, so you can see this precipitation gauge. As we mentioned, this is where there's a lot of evaporation going on. As that evaporation cools, there's a lot of precipitation that comes along with it. And these areas are extremely diverse in the types of species that can inhabit them. But unfortunately, they're also experiencing large-scale human destruction because the rainforests are constantly being harvested, and pharmaceuticals and things like that are being discovered in these environments are leading to a rapid deforestation in these areas. So they're really threatened. The next group are the savannas. I'm going to probably pop back to this image quite a lot. So the savannas here are in yellow, so we're talking about these yellow areas. Places like the African plains. They're, again, within sort of the between the tropics between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, those two latitude lines are at about 30 north and 30 south. So they're warm. They have about 30 to 50 centimeters of rainfall, which is not a whole lot. So they're actually prone to fires because of the lack of rainfall and them being so dry. So if there was a lightning strike or something, they'd be very prone to catching on fire. They're dominated by grasses and scattered trees, as you can see from this image. And their dominant herbivores actually are insects. So insects are sort of a major part of the food chain in these areas. Deserts, we talked a little bit about how deserts occur in really predictable areas. You can see them here in this image at the top. Deserts are areas where the precipitation is very low. They're the driest of all the biomes that we'll talk about. They typically have really unpredictable, the little bit of rainfall they get is very unpredictable. And the cycles of growth and reproduction in the desert are really influenced by what and when the rainfall occurs. They can be, it's often thought that deserts are really hot, but they actually can be quite cold too. It's really, desert environments is really defined by the lack of rainfall, not necessarily hot temperatures. And there's a term called desertification, and what that is the conversion of what we refer to as semi-arid regions, regions that are not quite, that get more rainfall than a desert does, but those areas are experiencing a water shortage or water loss. That's usually some indication of a very significant environmental problem. So the chaparral, this is an area, these are areas, you can see here, similar areas throughout the globe experiencing the same types of climate. These are characterized by dense spiny shrubs, lots of evergreens. These experience mild rainy winters and hot dry summers. And these also have vegetation that are adapted to periodic fire. So areas like we've seen some of the fires in Southern California, the vegetation, the human interactions there are not as adaptable to these fire conditions, but it's actually this type of vegetation and landscape is actually very adapted to those types of fires. The temperate grasslands, so these are like the prairies in the Midwest, and we also see these throughout Europe and Asia. They are mostly treeless, with the exception of like along rivers and streams you'll see trees, but they're mostly open grasslands. They are in areas that have relatively cold winter temperatures, and they experience a moderate amount of precipitation. But they also experience periodic droughts. These are the areas that we, see in like the old cowboy movies where the bison are grazing the plains. A lot of these grasslands in North America have been replaced with farms because they're very productive. It's very productive soils and very conducive to agriculture. So temperate broadleaf forests, these are in areas like where we live. They grow where there's enough moisture to support the growth of large trees, and they experience a wide range of temperatures. They have lots of, a whole lot of precipitation. It's not like a rainforest, but quite a moderate amount of precipitation. And they usually have a long growing season, about 5 to 6 months. But they're not quite as, the canopy is not quite as tight and tall and large as a tropical rainforest, but they still do support the growth of large trees and large vegetation. Carnivorous forests. These are dominated by just a few species of trees, talking about conifers. And I think if you took Bio 101, we talked about what conifers are. They're trees that are typically evergreen and have cones as their seeds. So they're conifers. These are areas in like the northern part of North America and Europe and Asia. They have long, cold winters and short, wet summers. And there are, that's it. The tundra, we think about the tundra. This is large expanses of the northern parts of North America and Europe and Asia. It's the expansive. It's in the Arctic area, and it's between the Arctic area and the permanently frozen polar ice. So it's not where the polar ice is, but it's between those broadleaf forests and the tundra. This is pretty much treeless area. It's characterized by permafrost, so you can see in this photo here, there's always some kind of frost condition and continuously frozen soils. And these areas receive pretty little precipitation as well, almost just a little, slightly more than the desert conditions would see. And then the polar ice, probably all see pictures of the polar bears. This is, again, at the poles, so areas like Greenland and Antarctica. It covers the land, again, at closest to the poles. It's much of the Arctic Ocean and the whole continent of Antarctica. These temperatures are extremely cold all year long, and there's very, very little precipitation. So even though we tend to categorize these different biomes, they're not really like self-contained. They're not really separated from one another. All of the parts of the entire biosphere on the planet are all linked and interacting with one another. So we have the global, what we call the global water cycle. So we have precipitation over the sea, we have evaporation from the water, that water moves towards land, there's precipitation on land, the precipitation that reaches the land can run off, a lot of it will run off into streams and rivers, which then make it back to the ocean. So we sort of see this, this cycle that we refer to as the water cycle of the precipitation that hits the land. Not all of it runs off. Some of it will flow into the groundwater, which will be taken up by vegetation, used again. That vegetation evaporation continues to occur, and that water makes it back into the water cycle. Some of the groundwater leaves the system completely and makes it back into the sea that way. We also see the similar things with nutrient cycles. So just as water is cycling through these environments, nutrients are as well. As plants take them up from the soil, animals will eat the plants, the animals will die, bacteria will consume them and return the nutrients into the soils. So although these systems are defined as individual and separate from one another, they're constantly they're sharing nutrients and water and influencing one another in that way. And that being said, there are a few things that you can certainly click through these questions at the end of this talk here just to give yourself a check to go over what we talked about. If you have any questions, please email me if there's anything that you are not clear on or need to have some clarification.